TR724 ekranlarından herkese merhaba. Bugün İtalya İnsan Hakları Federasyonu Başkanı politolog Antonio Stango ile olan Yalçınkaya davasını, Türkiye'de insan hakları ihlallerinin mevcut durumunu ve uluslararası insan hakları mekanizmalarının etkinliğini konuştuk. Antonio Stango, insan hakları konusunda 40 yılın üzerinde bir tecrübeye sahip ve başta Avrupa Birliği, Birleşmiş Milletler ve Avrupa Konseyi olmak üzere bu organizasyonların insan hakları mekanizmalarına uzun yıllar danışmanlık vermiş bir isim. Kendisi TR724'ün sorularını cevapladı.
Tomorrow the Yalçınkaya case will be heard in the Grand Chamber of European Court of Human Rights. Italian Federation for Human Rights was also submitted a third-party intervention to the court in the Sağlam case, which is very similar to Yalçınkaya. As an expert following the case very closely, what would you like to say about the importance of tomorrow's case, and what should we expect from this case?
Yes, actually this case is similar to the other one for which we presented a third-party intervention, and there are probably hundreds of cases like this because Turkey, unfortunately, from 2016 arrested and sentenced to heavy penalties hundreds of people, always in our opinion with not grounded motivations. So this wave of arrests and sentences is something extremely serious from the point of view of human rights defender and for human rights organization. The European Court of Human Rights can play an important role in this, especially the case that is going to be decided by the Grand Chamber can hopefully set a standard for future cases. Because when the case arrives to the Grand Chamber, it is the last level of jurisdiction. As far as I read from all the materials, and we are always thinking that there are hundreds of pages in cases like this to study, as far as I understand, also in these cases there is not an acceptable ground for sentencing a person against.
For more than 40 years, you have been advocating for human rights.
Yes.
And you have worked on human rights violations under many authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. And how do you see the current situation of human rights in Turkey, in general and especially after coup attempt?
Unfortunately, I don't see well the situation in Turkey, and of course I'm not the only one to have this idea. I think that many international human rights organizations are worried about what happens in Turkey. I've actually been watching Turkey already many years ago, when there was a time when we had all hope that the human rights situation in Turkey can improve a lot, and there were some improvement. Speaking perhaps at about 20 years ago or so, then at a certain point the trend changed, and we have been monitoring more and more violation of human rights. So our impression is that the system, the political system in Turkey has been going toward a certain level of authoritarianism. Of course, there are still democratic election, but with a predominant way of pressures from who is in power, that apparently has no intention to leave the power, but still there are independent media, still there is the frame of a democratic system, what there is not in many other countries under authoritarian regimes. So this gives us a hope. The situation is difficult, and we will be continuing to monitor the situation, and we hope that the international dialogue may facilitate the transition toward a more democratic, not a less democratic system in Turkey.
My next question is about international human rights mechanisms. Because there is a common complaint we hear from victims in Turkey. They say that international human rights mechanisms are not active and fast enough against Turkey. The main reason for this is the political and geopolitical conjuncture, they say. In your opinion, is the slowness of human rights mechanisms structural, or does the political context really play an important role? How do you see that?
Well, I even teach international organizations and the human rights, and one of my key points is exactly on the one hand to study the international organization system, then the international human rights law, and finally the way how the international system can force individual states to really apply the international human rights law. There is a gap between the international theory of human rights and the practice. So in general, the system, the United Nations mechanism and even the international courts lack efficiency, because they, of course, they must always interact with governments to a certain level, and sometimes, especially authoritarian governments, tend to reduce the possibility for the international mechanisms to be effective. This is true, for instance, for the United Nations Human Rights Council. This is true for the special rapporteurs of the United Nations system on several issues or on several countries. So the European Court of Human Rights is still one of the most efficient tools for defending human rights, but of course, being a court, its timing is quite slow, because it can decide to take a case only when all the internal jurisdiction has arrived to the final stage. So when a person has been already sentenced at the last possible level of appeals in his or her own country, and then again it takes some years. But it is important that there is and that it works. It will be great if we as an international community as a whole will manage to make all the system more efficient.
Another question is, what do you suggest to victims of human rights violations? How should they deal with the injustices they face under an authoritarian regime? Because you've been observing mostly Eastern countries for many years. How victims should defend their rights, how they should deal with the...
Yes, it depends on the country and on the system. There are some countries where it is practically impossible to do anything unless people are not ready to lose their lives. And this is the case of Iran, for instance, as we can see. Or there are countries where the system is so hard that even if they don't shoot on the demonstrators, like in Iran, but it is already practically impossible to do a demonstration without being arrested and sentences to long terms in jail. This is the case of Russia or Belarus or China and so on. So unfortunately, many countries are in such a condition that for the people is extremely difficult to act for their own rights. But probably the worst thing is to accept all this, even for people who live there. And so I am always encouraged to see that people, even in the worst condition, they have the courage to act, to do demonstration and so on. In other cases, it is even possible to arrange political participation, political parties. So this is the case of countries that are democratic with problems, like Turkey, for instance, democratic with many problems. But still they can do political action, political participation, and so on. And then whenever it's possible, to trust the international justice mechanism. For the countries that are within the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, study all the possibilities to apply to the European Court when it is the case, and interact, like in this case that we mentioned, with the proper international human rights organizations.
As the former Human Rights Watch director Kenneth Roth calls the zombie democracies, most of the people think that, I personally think that, when we have a so-called democratic regime with many problems,
yes,
it makes things even difficulter. Because when you go to the international mechanisms, they say that, you know what, you have these democratic institutions, you have, for example, constitutional court in Turkey, you have to
yes,
apply individual applies there. So, do you think that the existence of maybe small part of democracy, small institutions of democracy, could do things better or worse? Because mostly they are like, they seem like democratic institutions, but actually they're just a facade to block.
Yes, of course, these are problems. There are even some countries in the European Union that did steps back in the last few years from this point of view. I mean, there are all the proper institutions of the rule of law and of democracy, but the government managed to reduce their independence, for instance, the independence of the judiciary. It happens even in a couple of countries in the European Union, as I said, in the last few years. And this applies, of course, also to a country like Turkey. But I think that the expert, the person that study the situation, know well that we must not consider that in Turkey all is okay. And so we must help the international mechanism to act as far as it is possible. There are not big powers for this, but at least there is a power of influence. I say, for instance, the mechanism of the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review of the UN Human Rights Council. It is a system of dialogue between the civil society and the state, and with the international community of the other states. Of course, a government must have at least a minimum will of cooperating with this international mechanism and to improve its own human rights situation. But still, we can use this mechanism.
My last question is not difficult question, but it's hard to foresee, of course. But how do you see the future of Turkey because we have the presidential elections coming, and what do you think? Do you think that Erdogan regime will peacefully leave the power if they lose the election, or how do you see the future of democracy in Turkey?
Well, this is a question that is not exactly for the human rights expert or activist, but it is a good question for an analyst. And my understanding of the situation in Turkey is that, of course, Mr. Erdogan has no intention to leave the power, and he has been doing till now and will be doing all that is possible to remain sitting in power. Probably the public opinion in Turkey already in the last few years reduced their consensus on Erdogan, and for this reason he is trying to to understand which new alliances or coalition he can foresee for the future. Even it is in its own party probably there is some tendency to choose another candidate in case that he will be considered too weak to win the election. I mean, it's a complicated process in a country that anyway has a lot of political energy, let's say. So it is not an easy country, not all is clear, but for sure Mr. Erdogan will do its best or its worst to try and remain in power. We must also keep into consideration the extremely complicated international situation now. So Erdogan is trying to present himself as a key element of the international hopes to reach a solution to the conflict, especially after the open war of aggression from the Russian Federation to Ukraine and so on. He's trying to have, Mr. Erdogan, his voice heard in every possible international forum. This is also an element to take into consideration. He will try to present himself as a person that is important for the hopes of peace in the region, in a very big region that includes the wider Middle East, the Caucasus, the Black Sea. There is Iran close, etc. There is the influence of China. So it is an extremely complicated, extremely interesting situation from the point of view of an analyst, and we will certainly be monitoring what is happening with all the best wishes for the people of Turkey that are, of course, sharing the world with us. I mean, it's not a place, Turkey, that we can consider just a far place not to care about. We are all connected, not only in the Council of Europe, but the connection between all we in Europe and Turkey are very strong.